Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating historical record based on a video whose title translates perfectly to our theme, Same Battle, Different Faith. We're going to be looking at two leaders who faced the exact same terrifying crisis, yet responded with two completely opposite spiritual and psychological mindsets. It's a deep dive into the psychology of leadership and surrender, so let's just dive right in. Okay, to kick things off, I want you to picture something with me. Imagine this absolutely beautiful sailboat, its sails fully catching the wind. It's designed to just glide effortlessly, right? It lets the wind do all the heavy lifting. But then, contrast that with a sudden, violent storm. You've got a panicked captain who drops the sails entirely and starts screaming at his exhausted crew to just row frantically. This contrast between sailing on the wind and anxiously rowing perfectly captures the core theme we're exploring today. So how does this sailboat metaphor connect to the historical record? Well, let's look at the ancient Israelites and King Saul. Early on in his reign, the wind of the Spirit was definitely blowing. The sails were full, the ship was cruising. But what happens when a massive crisis suddenly hits? Instead of waiting for that wind to carry him through, Saul completely panicked. He felt like he was losing control. So he dropped the sails of faith and frantically grabbed the oars of human effort. If we jump into the historical records in 1 Samuel chapter 13, things are looking pretty grim. Israel is facing this massive, overwhelming threat from the Philistine army. Faced with just sheer terror, the Israelite troops actually start scattering. You can almost imagine Saul standing there watching his army literally melt away in front of him. He is gripped by extreme anxiety, feeling this absolutely crushing pressure that he has to take matters into his own hands to save the kingdom. Just look at how this timeline plays out, because it perfectly illustrates this agonizing cliffhanger of faith. For 6 excruciating days, his troops are fleeing. And to his credit, Saul actually waits at Gilgal for the prophet Samuel for almost the entire required 7 days. He didn't just throw in the towel on day 1. But on that 7th day, the pressure completely broke him. He went ahead and forced an unauthorized sacrifice. And honestly, the heartbreaking irony here is that the text notes Samuel arrived just moments after the sacrifice ended. It just goes to show how faith so often collapses right on that very threshold of just a little longer.
So, when he's confronted, how does Saul justify stepping completely out of bounds? He claimed he forced himself out of necessity. He essentially tells Samuel, look, the situation made me do it. I had no choice. It's such a brilliant illustration of human psychology. When we magnify our present fears and make them look bigger than our guiding principles, self-deception and rationalization follow right behind. And here is the absolute tragic irony of the whole shebang. Saul made this desperate, controlling move specifically to stop his men from leaving, but did it actually work? Well, originally he had 3,000 men. By trying to grasp control, his army shrank to a meager 600. In his frantic attempt to hold on to his people, he compromised his core principles, and he lost the people anyway. It really shows just how powerless our frantic rowing actually is when we're fighting the current.
Now let's completely switch gears and contrast Saul with his son. Saul is completely paralyzed. He's literally sitting under a pomegranate tree, hiding out with his 600 men and a priest. He's got resources, but he is frozen by fear. On the flip side, we've got Jonathan. He has almost nothing, just himself and his armor bearer. Yet he is boldly climbing a steep, rocky cliff right toward the enemy outpost. It is such a striking contrast, a leader paralyzed by what he might lose versus a leader boldly advancing with almost nothing to his name. Let's zero in on Jonathan's mindset for a second. Jonathan outright refused to view this conflict through the human lens of military numbers. Instead, he had what you might call an open faith, viewing reality entirely through the lens of God's covenant. Now, yes, the enemy was massive. That was a plain fact. But to Jonathan, the ultimate truth was that the enemy couldn't possibly be larger than a covenant-keeping God.
Which brings us to this super fascinating Hebrew concept, ulai, which translates to perhaps. Now, you might think perhaps sounds a bit wishy-washy, but this isn't a word of doubt at all. It's actually the exact opposite. Saying perhaps the Lord will act is a profound statement of trust. It means Jonathan is refusing to manipulate God's methods or demand a specific, guaranteed outcome. He couldn't guarantee success, but he surrendered himself entirely to divine possibility.
To really understand how absurdly disadvantaged they were, we just have to look at the number 2. Across the entire Israelite army, there were exactly 2 proper swords left. One belonged to Saul, and the other belonged to Jonathan. I mean, if you run the math on that, this war was over before it even started.
Yet, even with these incredibly bleak, literally impossible conditions, Jonathan still chooses action over retreat.
But make no mistake here, Jonathan's faith wasn't some kind of magic trick that just erased reality. Having faith didn't instantly turn that jagged cliff into a paved road. He still had to physically climb it, using his bare hands and feet, probably scraping his knees raw on the rocks. True faith doesn't ignore the harsh reality in front of us. It acknowledges the steep cliff but chooses the difficult physical obedience of climbing it anyway.
So after all that immense physical effort and sheer bravery to scale the cliff, what was the grand result? Jonathan and his armor-bearer defeated about 20 men. Against an enemy army that the text describes as being as numerous as sand on the seashore, 20 men is barely a rounding error. But that was it. That was the absolute limit of human effort. Jonathan had given it his all and could go no further. But right at the very edge of human limitation is exactly where divine intervention steps in. The moment Jonathan hit his limit with those 20 men, a massive, supernatural great trembling, an earthquake, shakes the ground. The entire Philistine camp is thrown into absolute uncontrollable chaos and terror. The human effort was just the tiny spark. The divine action was the explosion that followed. The text leaves absolutely no room for confusion about who the true hero of this story is. Spoiler alert, it's not Saul, and honestly, it's not even Jonathan. As the historical record explicitly states, so the Lord saved Israel that day. The ultimate subject of salvation is God alone. Humans made a tiny 20-person dent, but it was God who shook the entire battlefield. Meanwhile, how is Saul reacting to this miraculous victory? You'd think he'd be thrilled, right? Well, his religious anxiety actually causes him to spiral into a deeply toxic leader. Desperate to assert some kind of control, he forces a totally rash fasting oath on his men, starving and exhausting them to their absolute physical limits. He even attempts to execute the actual hero of the day, his own son, Jonathan, just to protect his own pride and fragile authority. It is a really dark portrait of a leader who experienced victory but just couldn't let go of the oars of control. And this brings us right back to where we started, raising the sail again. Because you see, this isn't just some ancient story about kings and battles. It's a mirror for our own inner leadership and our lives today. When the sudden storms hit us, do we see ourselves acting like Saul? Are we dropping the sails of faith, white-knuckling the oars of control, and just rowing with sheer anxiety? The source material actually drives all of this to a really profound theological conclusion. Think about it. Saul attempted to use a sacrifice to manipulate the situation, trying to protect his earthly kingdom, and he failed completely. Contrast that with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Facing the ultimate, terrifying cliff of the cross, Jesus completely surrendered to the Father's will. Where Saul fell through a desperate need for human control, perfect salvation was achieved through absolute surrender. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a direct and maybe slightly provocative question to chew on. How do you maintain the faith that was started by the Spirit? When a crisis hits your life, are you keeping your sails raised to trust the wind? Or are you frantically rowing in a panic, telling yourself that you forced yourself out of necessity? Let that question linger as you navigate your own battles this week. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.